A very warm good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Femita Murshina, and welcome back to this very special evening of Comvisage 2020, Day 1. Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication, Pune, is thrilled to bring to you our last speaker for the day, Mr. Karthik Nagarajan, Chief Content Officer of Wavemaker, to engage with us through today's workshop on content creation for podcasts. I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with his voice from the Filter Coffee podcast, but being the CCO for Wavemaker, Karthik helps brands start a communication journey that is beyond advertising. Prior to this, he set up the social media practice for Group M India and also led the Group M content practice. Before joining Group M, he headed Nielsen's online division in India, where he launched the digital audience measurement and advertising effectiveness products. He was also the country head for NM Insight, the joint venture between Nielsen and McKinsey for social media consulting in India. Besides, Mr. Nagarajan is a visiting faculty in many prestigious business schools across India and is a board member at ICOM, the premier global forum for marketing data and measurement. When he's not on his day job, he's a screenwriter, an independent filmmaker, and the host of the Filter Coffee podcast. It's our pleasure having you with us today, sir. Thanks a lot for coming. Now, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And I just need your help in sharing my screen. It says that it's disabled.
Yes, I'm on it, sir.
Sure. Well, I just thought since we're talking about podcast, I might as well use this microphone, which is normally something I use to record my episodes. So.
I apologize.
No, don't worry. Don't worry.
Yes, you should be receiving the co-host rights very soon.
Sure.
And in the meanwhile, just a brief reminder, I hope participants is ready with the list of their favorite podcasts and the idea for their very own podcast. So you can get Mr. Nagarajan's views on that. And once you start podcasting, you can thank him later. So
thanks so much. And just Karthik is good enough. Mr. Nagarajan makes it very, very formal and sterile. So we'll go with Karthik. And, I'm happy to take questions in between, but I'll leave it to you guys. You tell me how it's best done. I realize someone mentioned I'm the last speaker, so I'm assuming you had a fairly longish day. So I'm going to keep this as light as possible.
Awesome. Karthik, you have the co-host rights now. We can start sharing screen.
Great. You're able to see it?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Wonderful. Yes, thanks so much for the introduction. Just to summarize my journey so far, and I'm saying this because it's relevant to what we're going to talk about. Right? I started my career as an ethical hacker. Right? Back in the day, we used to write cryptographic algorithms to create internet security SDKs. Right? It seems it seems fairly interesting and fancy, but at the core of it is a fairly intense piece. Right now, from there, my career has moved on to areas that I did not really plan. Right? I got into research, I got into consulting, and then I got into the business of technology in the US. And then much later in my life, I got into digital marketing and social media, right? Which has then been the journey, at least in the last decade. The reason I'm sharing this with you is it has always been about discovering something that is exciting and interesting, and sort of being in that path when it turns from something that is fairly niche to something that is mainstream. Right? I think this journey is fascinating, and it is also very similar to what happened between me and podcasting as well. I've always been a huge fan of the medium. I would love to hear, some of the shows that you guys listen to these days. But I think it is safe to say over the last 10, 15 years, I've been extremely passionate about audio as a medium of communication. And it's only about, I think early last year that me and my producers thought of having a show which I was hosting. It was actually my producer's idea. And this journey has been one of the most fascinating journeys, I've had ever. And very, very happy to share that with you. I think what you can expect today is I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of podcasting. And then I also want to talk to you about some of the shows that have defined this industry, some of the shows that I've become a fan of over the years. And then sort of move on to your potential journey in podcasting and some of the questions that you might not have asked yourselves yet. And then I want to end the session with the business of podcasting, right? Talk to you a little bit about the overall content industry and where podcasting fits in, right? So like I said, happy to take questions in the middle. Feel free to type in, and I'll try and see if I can pause to take those questions. Else, we'll speak in the last 15 minutes where we have an interactive session as well. Okay, quickly going into how podcasting came into be. It's been a fairly recent phenomenon, right? Something that has happened in the last 20 years and something that has taken shape mostly in the last 10 years. As many of you know, of course, the word podcasting itself comes from what was designed back in the day for the iPod. And of course, the fact that all of us who are hosts of this medium are actually broadcasting to a larger audience. Right? But if you look at the word podcasting itself, that was coined in 2004. It's a very, very interesting article that was written by Ben Hammersley, who is a journalist with The Guardian. And the article is called Audible Revolution. It is still online. It's fairly recent in that sense. So I would urge you all to sort of read it. And there is a point in that article, where he talks about Apple's iPod and many other devices which have tried to imbibe talk radio. The sentence, as you can see here, he calls it, okay, what do I call it? Should I call it audio blogging? Should I call it podcasting? Should I call it guerrilla media? I'm extremely happy he didn't end up calling it guerrilla media. That would have been, a mouthful. To me, I think over the years, the name has had an interesting impact in the industry itself. Right. On one hand, I think it's a niche. We've all fallen in love with the medium and the name. On the other hand, personally, I feel the word has also sort of taken a needlessly nerdy meaning to it. Right. Podcasting just sounds like something that you need a lot of technology, a lot of equipment for, while in reality, that is really not the case. Right? So we'll talk a bit of that going forward. But quickly, I want to walk you through the timeline of podcasting in the world and also in India. I think while, like I said, the medium called podcasting as we know it today has existed only in the last 20 years or so. I think the larger definition for it, in fact, if I had my way, I will not call this podcasting. I would call this talk radio, because that is essentially what this is. And talk radio really goes back to the 1980s. Right? That's when many companies, there was, I think, one company in the US called Computing Services. I hope I remember the name right. And they started digitizing talk radio, which is basically audio content, which is not music, but conversational in nature. And they started distributing it in various digital forms. And of course, we're talking about an era which precedes the internet itself. Right? But I think things came to a pass in 2000, probably, when I2Go launched what was probably the first episodic content which is based in audio as part of their MP3 players. I2Go was one of the big MP3 players. You remember the time, I'm sure many of you were probably kids, when we had so many brands of MP3 players before, of course, the iPod came along. Right? That was a very, very interesting phase in terms of the technology evolution of it. But I think the defining moment came in 2000 when Adam Weiner, who is also the inventor of RSS, as we know, he created a way by which you could attach files, in RSS feeds, right? And interestingly enough, one of the first files that he attached was a Grateful Dead song, right? And that's how really the portable nature of podcast started. In a way, it is what I2Go did plus what Adam Weiner did, which really technologically made it possible for us to listen to podcasts. And like we discussed earlier in 2004, we saw Ben Hammersley from The Guardian coining the name. Cut to 2005 when this really became a large scale phenomenon was when iTunes 4.9 announced that it was going to support podcasts, and later on in 2006 Steve Jobs will also demo recording his own podcast in GarageBand, right? This was defining because up until then there was really no great way to play these files, right? Back in the time, if you look at how we used to listen to music before the iPod and before the iPhone, was largely on PC players, right? Like Winamp and everything else, which is really a very cumbersome process. And the moment this happened, listening to podcasts became very easy. It became, if you're traveling a long distance, you're taking a flight, you're taking a train, or you're driving, it was easy to sort of back up a few episodes of your favorite podcasts onto your iPod and take it along with you. I felt that was a signature moment, and many people don't know this. We talk a lot about people embracing podcasting as a culture, especially people in areas of power, and very surprisingly, one of the first people to do it in 2005 was George Bush, right? When he used to deliver his weekly address in the form of a podcast, right? I also remember hating it as a listener, the content of it, not the tech of it back in the day. Okay, so this is all the global story, right? Like, what has been the India story? I think safe to say, well, there have been many attempts. The first large-scale attempt in India was IndyCast, an initiative that was launched actually in multiple Indian languages, right? So 2006 was the year. And back then, you could find these podcasts in different websites. Then you could download it onto iTunes and then listen to it on your iPod. I think the big change in India really happened much, much later. And I want to say 2015, 16-ish, when platforms like Audio Boom and IVM podcasts, all of them were formed. And this really became a subculture. Right? This really became sort of a cult following, both among hosts as well as listeners. Right? So that's the India story. And globally, of course, 2013 is when things really took off, and Apple announced that at that point there were about 1 billion podcast subscribers, right, who has listened to at least one episode of a podcast in the last month. Right? And to me, really, the proof of the pudding of this entire journey is when the biggest deal happened in the podcasting space, and that was last year in 2019, when Spotify acquired Gimlet for a whopping $239 million, right? Which is an unheard of sort of a sum in the investment cycles, in the investment circles in podcasting. Right? So that really is the brief history. I've, of course, skipped many small points. Good for you to sort of listen to it. I'll try and share the links after the session. Right? Okay, great. We spoke about how talk radio is really the phenomenon, but what is it that makes podcasting or listening to podcasts this unique, right? To me, I think it's first important for us to define what is a podcast, right? I think it is content that is theme led. I think a podcast is talk radio, which is about something or about someone. Right? One of the first big podcasts, even back in the early 2000s, right before the iPod happened, was actually the NFL team, which is the Patriots. They started putting out a show which was about everything that was happening within the team. Right? Think of it as like a Liverpool today putting out a show. It was like that, right? Which is a big hit, and that show still continues today. You can listen to it today. It's called as Patriots Unfiltered. Right? Um, and in India, if you see, there are shows like Pesa Vesa. If you are really lost about the world of personal finance, that is the show to listen to. B50 is the person's handle, Twitter handle. So he puts it out, and it's a brilliant show, and it is always about money. Right? And an interesting fact that you'll appreciate is shows about money have always done well in every part of the world, right? Whether it is Paisa Vaisa here or Planet Money, which really is the show that the founders of Gimlet had created, right? Which was their most popular show. I think the other aspect of podcasting is, if you ask me the question, hey, what if I record my audio on YouTube, and is that not podcast? Maybe it is, maybe it is not. These are all soft definitions, right? But to me, I think to be technically correct, um, it is the episodic format, the episodic form factor in audio that is easily distributable across platforms, right? And especially made for mobile devices, which really defines what podcasts are. Okay, now to go back to the question, why is listening to podcasts a unique experience? Um, Now, I don't know the scientific answer to this, but experientially, podcast is the most intimate storytelling form, the most intimate storytelling medium. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that um, you're mostly listening to it using an earphone or headphones, right? Which means it is really really close to your being overall, right? Um, and unlike video, like video has a lot of distractions, right? There is visual, there is sound, there is what is happening around the protagonist, so many things. But in podcasting, when you listen to a podcast, a very very large part of your subconscious is actually listening to it, right? So I think these are the elements. So in that sense, it's more of a lean forward medium as against video, which is it's a very lean back sort of a medium, right? So I think that is one aspect. The other aspect is podcasting has always been successful in building communities, right? Whether it is about money, like we spoke about, whether it is about tech, or whether it is about space, right? Whether it is about space ventures, or whether it is about art, right? The thing about podcasting is, given its medium, it's very easy for people to reach a very niche audience, right? Now, today, if I want to, I can create a show which only talks about single malts, right? And people who love single malts will find that show. It's easy to find. Right? Today, if I want to, I can create a show only for audiophiles, right? People who love music, but people who love audio equipment more, right? So all of this is possible, and podcasts create great communities, right? I think the third part, which probably all of you know already, is the convenience of it. It can be consumed in different time nuggets, right? You're in the metro, you only have 10 minutes, there is a show for that. Or you can listen to some part of your favorite show. You are in vacation, and you want to just listen to podcast episodes for the next hour, next 2 hours. There is a show for that. Right? And probably the most important thing that we've all done over the last 6 months is to wash vessels. Right? So you have a 30-40 minute chore at home, you want to do this, great companion to do it, right? So that convenience of doing something else while you're listening to podcasts and intently listening to podcasts is also a great reason why it makes it a unique experience. You can't do that with video, right? And for me, I think probably the most important reason is whatever is your show, whether it is on entertainment, whether it is on cinema, whether it is on technology, you will always be more informed at the end of it, right? Even if it is a show, even if it is an episode that you really didn't like, right? To me, I think that is the reason why many people seek out podcasts. Right? They want to sound more intelligent. They want to know more about the world they live in, and that really is for me the most important reason. Okay, why do I feel podcasts as a medium will work in India? And one of the reasons why, as a marketer, I spend a lot of time in audio is because I feel India has always been an audio first country. Right? Why do I say that? If you go back to mythology, if you go back to how, we as a civilization were brought up, it was all on audio stories. Right? If you go back 20, 30 years, our parents used to listen to sports largely through transistors. Right? And as a nation, when we started broadcasting, when All India Radio happened, when FM happened in the late and the mid 90s, um, all of that reached the large part of the population of this country through transistors and radio sets. Right? I can bet that there is no household in India which doesn't have an old transistor. Right? If that household has been in existence for a couple of decades. Um, if you cut to the urban India, right, our lifestyle, the amount of time we spend on roads in traffic, right, that image from Bombay that you see on your screen is very symbolic of many Indian roads, right? So that makes it extremely easy and optimum for audio based content, right? And of course, last but not the least, the mobile phone penetration in India, whether it is feature phone or smartphone, sets it up beautifully for consumption of audio. Right? To me, these are the reasons why I feel India is always being designed more for audio than it is video. It might sound counterintuitive, when you think of it that way, but I really firmly believe in it. Right? I'll give you an example. A few years back, we were working with Unilever, and we realized that there are parts of India which are still very media dark. Right? If you take places in Chhattisgarh, places in Bihar or Jharkhand, there are places where there is no outdoor media, there is no television, there is no digital, etc. We were thinking, okay, how do we really reach out to people there? Right? But the one thing that was common to everyone was the mobile phone. Right? So we launched this entire music service on demand. Right? You just need to give a missed call to a number, and then a series of songs will follow. A series of entertainment shows will follow. Right? And within that, Unilever sort of weaved in its own message. Right? So we called it in local lingo Khan Kajura Tesan. Right? So to me, that's a great example of why audio works in this country. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about what should be your story, when it comes to podcasts. And before that, it's important for us to understand who are the people who podcast. I think there are 4 or 5 different kind of people who have become great podcast hosts. The first, I would say, is networkers. Right? People who need a guest in their show. Right? The show is not about them, but the show is about the conversations that they are having with their guests. Right? To me, one of the longest running shows and my favorite audio show ever is a show called Fresh Air. It's hosted by the legendary Terry Gross, and it belongs to the network called NPR, National Public Radio. It's a big radio network. Now it has become a great podcasting network as well. Right? So the kind of people that Terry Gross interviews, it could be the legends in music, the legends in politics, could be great authors, great journalists and all of that, right? So she's a networker. She has access to people, and she's able to create a show like this. Similarly, if you are someone who's excited by startups, if you want to become an entrepreneur, you absolutely have to listen to a show called How I Built This. From the founders of Ben and Jerry's, to the founders of Cisco, to the founders of Southwest Airline, to the founder of Amazon. All of these founders sort of come to the show and they talk about their startup story. Right? Again, Guy Raz, the guy who hosts the show, has a wonderful network that he's able to leverage and bring guests from. Right? My own show, which is the Filter Coffee podcast, will fall under this category. Right? The show is what it is because of the guests that we have on the show. If you're into marketing, I'm sure you already do, but if you're not, you should listen to my good friend Varun's show called Advertising is Dead. And probably my most favorite podcast in India is my good friend again, Amit Verma's show, The Seen and the Unseen. Right? If you want to know the country, its history, how it works, etc., that really is the show. It's also a great example of why a length of an episode really doesn't matter. Right? Some of the episodes of, in fact, even within this list, if you look at Varun's episodes, they're usually 30 to 40 minutes. My episodes are usually about an hour. And Amit's episodes are usually about 2 to 3 hours, right? 2 hours so easily. Right? So if you haven't checked out, please do listen to these shows. And I'd love to hear, when we do the Q&A session about some of the shows that you like. Right? The other kind of people who host podcasts are experts. Right? People who know a subject really well and they can sound knowledgeable about it. And most importantly, someone who can also be sensitive about it. Right? There are a lot of shows today on LGBTQ rights, which are hosted by people who know the space really well. Right? Gay BCD is a fantastic show. There are shows about mental wellness, right? Which experts sort of do it. Right? Internationally, if you look at it, one of my favorite shows of last year is a show that Malcolm Gladwell put out. Right? If you don't know the person, he's the guy who wrote famous books like The Tipping Point and others. Right? And Malcolm Gladwell's show, which is the revisionist history, was actually one of the most listened to shows last year in 2019. The show is really about him taking us back to an event that happened in history and talking about what really happened, right? Giving you a completely different perspective, right? An instance is all of us would have read about the Bengal famine of the early 40s. But what we really don't know is the impact of what happened in London, which really led to the famine. Right? It's not something that happened because of the weather. It's not something that happened because of anything else, but Britain's refusal to send grains to Bengal. Right? And there is a show called Mothers of Invention, which really is about female entrepreneurs and thought leaders who are talking about climate change. It's a brilliant show. And if you haven't listened to it, you should listen to it. It's a very, very sensitive, probably one of the most knowledgeable conversation on the subject. In India, you have a lot of shows on fitness, on health and wellness. The Habit Coach is a great example, which is hosted by Ashton Doctor. Okay, the other kind of people who host podcasts successfully are storytellers and creators. Right? People who can hold the attention by themselves. They could be writers, they could be narrators of great work. To me, I think if there is one show that really changed the scale of podcasting in the world, it has to be The Serial. Right? The Serial is a show that I think happened a few years back, and it was a reality crime show. It's not a reality show, but it is based on true incidents. It's a story of a boy called Syed, who in the US was, according to them, wrongfully detained for murder of his classmate, which, according to them, again, allegedly, he did not commit. right? So that was a spine-chilling sort of a story, and suddenly overnight, you had millions of people listening to the show across the world. It just caught everybody's imagination that an experience like this can be created in the audio format. In India, a lot of mythology and a lot of folk tales have been taken to the audio form. A lot of you might remember Nilesh Mishra's show. He's done many different shows. My favorite being UP Ki Kahaniyan, where he picks up folk stories and sort of puts it out in his own great voice. Right? If you are from Tamil Nadu, like I am, you will recognize that image, which is Ponniyin Selvan, which is one of the greatest pieces of literature to have been written in Tamil. And today, Kavita Jiva, who narrates this book, this story, in very colloquial Tamil, it's one of the most listened to shows in the last 3 to 4 months. Right? And Audible, which 6 7 months back invested heavily in podcasts, has created a lot of fictional narrative shows, right? Including ones which have introductions voiced by Mr. Bachchan. Moving on from there, something else that happens with great regularity in the world of podcasts is journalism. Right? It's not the journalism that we see on television. I don't even know if you can call that journalism in India anymore. But this is journalism on specific topics. Right? For example, for the first time ever, the Pulitzer uh, instituted a prize last year for podcasting, right? And it went to Ira Glass's show, which is one of the most listened to shows in the world. It's called This American Life, again coming from the stable of NPR. This American Life, for instance, it picks up different aspects of America. It could be political in nature. The episode that got the Pulitzer, in fact, was about the immigration laws between US and Mexico and how that is leaving people stranded at the border. Um, so it's a great narrative on life in America. To me, that's as good a journalism as anything CNN puts out. My most favorite show, the show that I listen to religiously 3 times a week, is Pivot. And if you are planning to be a part of the internet economy, whether as a brand, whether as an agency, or as a .com, you have to listen to the show. Kara Swisher, who is a noted journalist, and Scott Galloway, who's one of the biggest opinion makers on digital media at this point. They both co-host the show, and we have to listen to it. They're a riot together, completely different kind of people. Kara Swisher is more of a seasoned journalist. Scott Galloway is a guy who has some really revolutionary ideas about what should and shouldn't be. Right? So they make a great pair. In India, I would want to say that this space is actually empty at this point. Right? We don't really have great shows which are coming from the journalism stable. Right? I think the closest is what Indian Express puts out there, called Three Things, where they talk about 3 big news issues. But this space is really up for grabs for whoever wants to create that show. Right? And of course, the other part of it is entertainers. Right? These are culture commentators. These are comedians, musicians, rappers. Right? Many of you might or might not know this, but Comedy Central really was a thriving podcast as much as it was a thriving television channel back in the mid to 2000s. Right? What they did was actually have short formats, right? 1 minute, 2 minute clips of great comedy, both video and audio, which they put out on podcasts, which they couldn't really find the right way to do in their television channel. And one of the many things that inspired is AIB itself. Right? If you remember, when AIB came out, it was actually on SoundCloud as a podcast. Right? And of course, today Cyrus puts out a great show, one of the most listened to shows in India, Cyrus Says. Okay, now to probably the most important question, and probably the reason many of you are here today. Is podcasting for you? Right? There is no there's no science to knowing that. But a few questions I would love to ask you is: do you have an opinion? Are you a person who has a very strong opinion about something, right? It need not always be about something that is very serious. It need not be about the economy or politics or society. It could even be um, about something that you do daily. Right? It could be about the way you write. It could be about um, design. It could be anything, right? You have an opinion, and that's a very important thing. Um, Probably the most important thing in your journey of becoming a podcast host. Right? Um, are you a journal maker? Right? Not that journals have anything to do at all with podcasts, but there is a certain regularity to journals which make it very similar to what we all do in podcasts. Right? Especially if you want to do a show by yourself where you don't have any guests, it's important uh, to sort of do this on a regular basis. It's important to collect your thoughts, to be able to articulate it, to be able to put it out there, and be okay with sharing it with the world, right? Do you like to create? Right, podcast is as much an expression, as much an art as anything else, as slam poetry or as hip hop or as painting, right, or as music for that matter, right? And it is important to have that fire in you, which makes you want to create something, right? But along with it also is the discipline to create, right? I am a screenwriter, or at least I'm a wannabe screenwriter, but I haven't really been writing regularly, right? I have a day job which makes it very difficult to do, but these are all excuses, right? Uh, Creation requires, intuitively it might not sound like that, but creation requires more discipline than some of the mundane tasks that we do every day, right? And especially in podcasting, which depends on regularity, which depends on you taking out time, which depends on other people's time, it needs more discipline, right? And if you are going to do any sort of a show that involves another person, right, either a co-host or a guest, you need to be a good listener, which basically means you need to have that ability in you, even though if you want to say something immediately, to just hold it a minute longer, to be able to hear out what the other person has to say, whether you agree with it or not, and then put your point of view out there. Basically, you need to be the opposite of Arnab Goswami. Right? Um, if you have many of these things going for you, then I think you should seriously consider podcasting. I feel podcasting is for you. Right? Okay, what should you talk about? Is probably a question that many of you have in your minds. Right? To me, I think this journey is a very long journey, right? Some of the best known podcasts that I spoke to you about probably have put out hundreds and thousands of episodes out there, right? Um, it is a longevity that really counts in this medium, right? Um, it's quite normal for you to not see traction for your shows in the first few weeks, months, even a year. Right? So you need to be able to love what you want to do long enough for this to work for you. Right? So when you think of a topic, think about that. The second thing is, I spoke about how podcast is an art and all of that, but it is also a great tool to have in your career, right? If you want a career in design, having your own show on design thinking is a great asset to it. Many of you are aspiring marketers. To have your show about marketing, an aspect of marketing, right, will be a great asset to it, right? If you're in the business of cinema, having your show, which is about appreciating cinema, will be a great asset. So you have to be absolutely selfish in the topic, right? It's not just for the larger good or entertainment of others, but how will it help you is a question that you should ask yourselves. Right? How much time you will have is a very, very important question, right? Today, as students in such a prestigious institute, I'm sure you have very little time, right? And tomorrow, when you go into the world of leadership trainees and management trainees, or leaders in many different organizations, time is a currency that you're going to have less and less of. Right? So it's extremely important for you to know how much time you have, for you to know how much time you can put into this, and your shows should definitely, most definitely, depend on that. And just like any startup that you're doing, right? You need to think in terms of whether you want to do it alone or whether you want a co-founder, right? Some great shows around the world have a co-host, and having a co-host, like having a co-founder, is always wonderful, right? It helps you bounce off ideas. It keeps you conscious. It's just a great thing to share this load with someone. And in many cases, if you see some of the greatest sports shows, they're actually conversations between two people, right? And in many cases, there are no guests, because all the point and counterpoint sort of come from the host and the co-host, right? So it's a great advantageous position to be in, to have a co-host, right? But most importantly, whatever the topic that you pick, right, you should be able to love it yourself. If you can't listen to the episodes you're putting out yourself, more than a few number of times, then chances are many other people might not enjoy it as well. Right? So put out what you would like to listen to as an audience yourself. Right? That's very important and often underrated. Okay, now you've decided on your topic. You've decided that you want to be a podcaster. What are the things you need to do to get it right? Right? Which are the things that might surprise you? One is you need to know your flow, right? And today, if you haven't done this before, what you think is your flow, what you think is your rhythm, what you think is your sound, might not actually be that. Right? Um, I spoke to you about Varun's show, but Varun was one of my pilot guests, and he was really my guinea pig in that sense. And I did 5 or 6 different episodes, and they were absolutely terrible. Right, I couldn't listen to even one of them today. They were very long, they were long-winded. I was doing a lot of ahs, during the recording. It just wasn't sounding great, right? And I wasn't enjoying it myself. It's only after I found out what my sound is, which is a combination of how you feel and listening to yourselves, I realized what is the true flow, the true rhythm of the show. And that is something no one can help you with, unfortunately. And fortunately, it's something that you should discover yourself. Right? You should really speak to your listeners. Right? It's very, very easy for us, and it's not just in podcasting. Right? If some of you are YouTubers, we take some of our most loyal listeners, who probably are people we know and friends, and people who are strangers, but we know that they'll definitely listen to it anyway. We take them for granted. Please don't. They are your biggest sounding boards. They invest time to listen to your show. And that really is what you're seeking from a large number of audience. Right? You're not seeking money, but something that is much more precious than that. You're seeking their time. Right? You need to understand, and you need to be answered to you need to be able to answer to yourself, why is it worth someone's 40 minutes? And you need to take these listeners very, very seriously. The third thing is scale, right? Wherever your show is, you have to think 10x. What do I need to do to make it 10x from here? If your show has 5 listeners, think what do I need to do to get it to 50? Show has 1,000 listeners, think 1,000,000, right? So those are some of the decisions, and that you need to be, this question needs to keep you awake at all times, right? Sometimes the scale can come through what you do in social media. Sometimes the scale can come to you by the way of the guests you have on your show, and their social media assets, right? Sometimes it's just a topic. Some topics just resonate beautifully. I spoke to you about this Tamil literature piece someone is doing. That person didn't have a great social media following, Kavita. It is the topic that she picked, that book, which really had the following. Right? So think scale all the time, and think word of mouth all the time. Right? Random conversations that happen on Twitter on, hey, what are some of the best podcasts to listen to in India? Right? And people's answers to that question. You need to be there. your show needs to be there. That is your goal, right? So focus on every listener. Make sure that the word of mouth on your show is good, right? And understand the word of mouth on your show. There might be great learnings from it, even though it is not positive. And lastly, there are no rules because the medium itself, especially in India, is so nascent that no one has really cracked it to say that with confidence that this is exactly the way you should do it. Right? It's an open field, and it is awaiting its leaders and champions. Okay, so we spoke a lot about podcasting itself, and the last segment of it, I know I've taken more time to get here than I wanted to, but I'll just quickly briefly talk to you about it. The business of podcasting. Right? See, today, if you look at content as a business, it is being driven by video. Right? I don't know if you know this. As we speak, there are probably about 42 OTT channels in India at this point, right? Mainstream ones. And this can very, very easily go into 2x, 3x of this in the next couple of years. Right? So when you look at where is money going to come from, money is going to come from either a platform, which is into the business of content, which basically means a media house, or money is going to come from a brand. Right? Now, many of you are in the business of marketing, so it's important for you to know that a brand's marketing budget is not going to shift, astronomically year to year. Right? If a brand is spending 100 crores in 2019, probably they'll spend 110 or 120 crores, next year. It's not going to be suddenly 500 crores, right? So the money that a brand wants to invest in podcasting will have to come at the cost of probably something else. Right? So that is the stage where we are in. And podcasting by itself today doesn't have the critical mass for brands to sort of jump in immediately and do it tomorrow. Right? A study that I trust really puts the number of podcast listeners in India roughly at about 15 to 20 million people, right? Which is not a lot. To give you a sense, Facebook is probably about 400 million people, right? And a LinkedIn or an Instagram are closer to the 100 million mark, or probably in some cases even more than that. Right? So 15 to million people listening to a show at least once a month is too small, right? And if we look at people who are regular listeners to podcasts, it's probably going to be roughly about the 10 million range and not even 20 million, right? So it's a very nascent piece, which is why I feel areas of monetization really comes down to three things. Right? One of the things that you don't really think of when you think podcasts is the content that you put out there is really there for perpetuity. Right? We spoke about RSS feeds at the beginning of the entire history on podcasts. The way podcast works is there is a network, and from that network, all the platforms sort of take the data automatically. Right? It's not a manual process. So tomorrow, if you're creating a show, and if your show needs to be on Spotify is interested in. I mean, it's not even about Spotify's interest. The way Spotify will take the show is it will take your show automatically from that feed, and it will take the artwork automatically from that feed. It will take the episodes automatically from that feed. Your job is just to get it to that feed, which is really the RSS piece of it. Right? So once you have it there, all your episodes, for example, my show has about 75 episodes till now. Right? There are shows with 500 episodes. So all of these shows are out there in perpetuity in the cloud. So programmatic advertising really is, for example, if you're a network like IBM is, like NPR is, and if someone wants to advertise in that network, their ads will go on to all the episodes of your show, right? Because you can never really tell what a listener is going to listen to. Maybe he'll listen to the 10th episode of your show. Maybe he'll listen to the 100th episode of your show, right? So this is what I mean by programmatic. Programmatic is ads that run on all of the shelf content of all shows, right? Next is brand integrations, right? If you take brands like Squarespace, for example, in the US, they've been built on what we do on what they did on podcasts. Squarespace is a platform like GoDaddy, and you can build your websites on that platform, right? And it has found great success in doing integrations with podcast hosts. Right? And of course, then there are sponsored shows, which are very little. But today, if I'm a bank or if I'm a mutual fund, I would blindly advertise on Pesa Vesa, right? So those are the different areas by which you monetize. Now, you could do this alone. Today, you could have your own platform. There are platforms like Anchor, which helps you create your show and really put it out there into the network that I spoke to you about. Right? There are companies like Hubhopper, which really help people. Right? Um, when you put out your show, what you really need to know is the big decision you need to make is, are you doing it alone, which means you're producing your show yourself, or are you doing it with a producer where you join a network like IBM and then sort of do it, right? So that is one of the big decisions that you need to make, and then everything else that I spoke about will follow. Right? So I would leave you with three things, probably to inspire you. One is you should remember that the gymlet of India has not happened yet. Right? It is still open, and any of you can sort of become that. Right? The serial of India has not happened yet. We don't have a show that is so big that it changes the nature of the medium. Right? In other words, the Man Ki Baat moment, which was great for radio, has not happened in podcasts just yet. Right? So the arena is open. You should feel inspired. It's one of the best times to be wanting to become a podcast host. Right? So with that, I'll probably pause and open myself to questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Karthik. Would you? Okay, you're stopping the screen share. Great.
Yeah.
So participants, I see that the questions are pouring in. That's a really good sign. Unfortunately, a few questions are probably on the similar lines. So in case you feel that this question has been answered, then probably we'll skip yours. So I hope you understand. Over to you, Femita. You can begin with Namita.
Thank you so much, sir, for this incredibly interesting session. It was an enlightening ride. We really learned a lot from you. Now, let's go to the Q&A session. Namita, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, sir. This was such an insightful session, and I mean, it took me to a completely different world. I wanted to know what kind of an investment would someone who is just starting a podcast be looking at? I mean, it seems like it's fairly low when I just think of maybe just a studio space, but I wanted to know if I am mistaken by thinking that it's a fairly low investment, or if there is more to it than what meets the eye. That was a little confusing.
Right. No, I think there are probably three elements which will result in cost. Right. One, of course, is the equipment that you need, right, to record. Now, before the lockdown, many of us were actually recording in studios, right? And that's because we really felt very strongly about the quality of what we're putting out there. Right? So that will cost us a few thousands every time we go to the studio. Right? But what the lockdown has really taught me, especially, is it's not really necessary. Right? During the lockdown, my last 10, 15 shows I've done with this phone mic. Right? It's only a few days before that I even acquired a setup at home. Right? But this is only if you want to really take the quality to the next level. For you to start up, and I feel as strongly about my last 15 episodes as I did about my previous 60. Right? You could do it with this. So this is one part of it. If you have a reasonably good laptop, you could record and you could edit yourself. Right? There are very simple softwares like Audacity, which you can use to do that. Then there is the other part of it, which is the production itself. Right? Again, if you really want your show to have music at some point, or any kind of a post-production effect, you would need an experienced engineer or a sound engineer or an editor, right? That is the other part of it. That is really up to you. Today, it's not that difficult even for you to sort of pick it up yourself and sort of play around with basic editing on your recordings, right? So I really would not advocate any major investments in this at all. If you really want to, for example, a setup like this would cost you anywhere from 4 to 5,000 to probably 15, 20,000 if you really want to go for the high-end microphones, right? Which this is not. And editing softwares, again, most of them are free or some basic subscription. Like I said earlier, the third and probably the most important decision is for you to realize, are you going to need a producer to do all of this for yourself and put it out there in the network, or are you going to do it yourself, right? Again, if you're doing it yourself, you can get a platform like Anchor, which is really very, very affordable as a subscription. But if you need to, go to a producer, that really will take some time and some negotiations. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Namita. Avaita, are you ready with your question?
Yeah. Hi, good evening, Karthik. Thank you for the really insightful session. So while I was looking at your presentation, a few layered questions came up. So I sort of numbered them down, if that's fine. So the first is basically that how important are podcast cover arts in terms of differentiating you from the sea of podcasts that are available. So the title that you choose and the art that you use for the graphics for the cover, how important is that in differentiating your podcast from the rest? And does it in any way help in working towards a niche audience for your particular podcast or not?
I think it's quite important, right? For me, it's the album cover, right? If I'm a musician, I'm going to invest a lot of energy in figuring out what my album cover is, right? It is exactly that, if not more. Right? You have to remember that that's what people are going to see on their screens most number of times. And I think the point I want to make here is you have to be extremely proud of every element that you put out there, right? Whether it is an introduction to your guest, or whether it is the album cover, or what you call it, or what you write as a description of an episode also, right? I think all parts of this needs to be inspiring, and I'm personally extremely passionate of the album art.
Right. Also, first of all, how many different platforms are there that you can broadcast your podcast on, and how do you choose which one to go for? Like, where should my podcast be? How do you decide on that?
Yeah, so this is one of the very common misunderstandings in this space, right? Today, if you are uploading your podcast into the network, right? Where using RSS feeds, really you're not choosing the platform, right? Because all of the platforms, whether it is a Spotify or a Google podcast or an Apple podcast, all of them sort of pick up from the same feed, right? So unless you're of course doing an original, right? So today, if you take someone like a Gaurav Kapoor, he's doing an original podcast for Spotify, which is called 22 Yarns, right? Which is on Spotify alone. And today, if you take a Neha Dupia, she's doing a show which is specifically only for Savan, which is called No Filter Neha. Right? So these are originals which you can't listen to on all the other platforms. But everything else, you just need to get it out there in the podcasting feed, and all platforms sort of pick it up from there.
Okay, so that also leads me to my last question, that how difficult is it to get into the podcast space? What are the so-called barriers to entering the podcasting arena?
Most of the barriers that I know of are just here. There are no technology barriers, right? Like I said, I think if you need the support of someone, see, for example, my show is produced by Indus Vox Media, IVM, right? So it was their idea that I should host a show, and I was very lucky with that perspective, right? But if I was not doing what I'm doing for a living, I would have had to probably pitch the show to Indus Vox Media and say, hey, do you want to produce this, right? And that is probably one, entry barrier. You need to be able to, if you need a producer, to be able to pitch a show to them. And most of them are very welcoming, right? Today there is another platform called Avaz, which does a lot of regional language content, right? And then there are platforms like Hubhopper that I spoke to you about. So this is one part. Other than this, if you want your show to be an original, if you think of a great idea for Spotify, you'll have to go pitch it. Other than this, there are no barriers.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Avaita. Rishabh, are you there?
Yeah, I'm
Rishabh?
here.
Yeah, you can voice out your question now. Yeah.
So, good evening, sir. So, my question was like during the course of the presentation, you clearly stated how podcast is one very audio-centric platform. So there are various entertainers like Varun Thakur or Tanmay Bhatt, for those examples, that they are making up podcasts which are being released on Spotify. But on the other hand, a very video format of that particular podcast is being released on YouTube. How much does, since podcast is one growing industry in India right now, it has not reached its pinnacle yet. So how much an impact will this kind of a split platform choice or going into both video and podcast cause to the very growth of podcasts in general? Like if such big people who have such an influence choose that for an option, then how can we go about the other way?
See, the reason people do that, especially in India, right, is because of the low base of podcast listeners in India, right? Today, you wouldn't see this, for example, a Malcolm Gladwell putting out a shoulder content in video, or a Guy Raz putting out something like this, right? It's probably because it's a little niche for someone like Tanmay Bhatt, right? This is one. Second is, I would always recommend, if you can, to put out video as shoulder content from a promotion perspective, right? I think, I personally tried it in my own show. Varun has tried this in many of his shows. It only builds, think of it as a trailer to your podcast, right? From that perspective, I think it makes sense, right? But other than that, to have your show both in the video format as well as in the audio format, for me, it beats the purpose. And people do it only because they're insecure about the number of listeners on podcasting.
Sure, sir.
Thank you, Rishabh. Pomili, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can go.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So, had a wonderful insight from your session. And I want to just ask that, how do you, because podcast is for such a niche market audience, so how do you make sure that there is consistency, listenership in your channel? And do you feel like...
Did we lose
you're
Pomili?
on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
I lost you. Do you feel like?
Yeah. So I asked you that because podcasting is such a niche market audience. So do you feel like that? How do you make sure that there is consistent listenership in your channel?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question, and I wanted to actually address it in the last slide, but actually forgot to mention this. Thank you for asking me this question, Pomili. See, I think one of the most important things in hosting a podcast is the regularity of it, right? Because people, I did a research recently on my own show, and most of them told me that when they listen to the episode, when there is a notification from the app, right? So let's say you're subscribing to my show on Spotify, or let's say you're subscribing to my show on Savan or on Apple Podcasts. You will have a go-to app for your podcast listening. And when you subscribe it, you will get a notification saying, "Hey, Karthik Nagarajan's show is out, episode is out. Do you want to listen to it?" Right? So that is when they listen to the episode, or that is when they add it to their playlist or whatever. Right? So regularity, for example, if your show releases every Wednesday, for you to regularly release it every Wednesday is very important. Right? If you change that, you will see there is a huge difference in your audience numbers. You also use the word consistency, and consistency is not just about the timing of it; it is also the quality of it. Right? You know, people don't have patience. Like I said, 45 minutes of your time is probably more valuable than lakhs and lakhs of rupees, right? I'm asking for that investment. You can earn lakhs and lakhs of rupees later on in life also, but you can't get back this 45 minutes, right? So if people don't find a great quality in 1-2 episodes, their patience wear off, and there are so many podcasts for them to choose from, right? When I'm going for a run, I listen to an episode. If I don't like it, I quickly change it. I'm not going to wait for my run until the podcaster puts out a better episode, right? So consistency in the quality of what you're giving out is extremely important, right? So that is something else you should keep in mind as well.
So can I ask a second question?
Yes, please.
So because advertising is done to monetize it mostly, so do you feel that anyway it affects the rhythm of podcasting, like in between for the listenership also?
Yes, but advertising also sort of sustains the industry, right? Advertising affects the rhythm of anything that it is on, right? I am part of that industry, and but that's the truth of it, right? It does, no question about it. But sometimes it also gives you a break, right? There are a few times where you could also say that an advertising actually gives you some time to think about what was talked in the first half of the episode, and then maybe listen to it with a better perspective in the second half of it. But so mostly it is an irritant. Yeah.
Basically, a good host is required.
Right. But, advertising also sustains all of us, right? So in that sense, it's something that we can't live without.
Definitely. Going forward with the last question, that in any ways in the future, do you see like that the podcast and radio can some way merge together because of the...
Not just in the future, actually, even in the past, right? A lot of the shows in the US, which are big podcasts today, actually used to be radio shows. See, the problem in India is that of regulation, right? There are only few people who can start FM channels in India. And you basically need to be a media house to be able to start an FM channel in India, right? And because of this, most of the channels sort of relied on music, and especially film music alone as their programming. So, which is why today you don't really associate radio with podcasts or talk radio, right? But they can certainly coexist, and they do coexist in many parts of the world.
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Pomeli. Karthik, do you wish to take more questions? Because we have already overshot the time.
I don't mind taking a couple of more, because I can see that there are a lot, and I should have ideally stopped much earlier. Yeah.
Great. Then is Karthik here? Karthik?
Yeah, Femita, can I just intervene? I'm very sorry. Yeah,
Yes,
my only appeal to is, because many students want to ask their questions to Karthik, if we can restrict number of questions per participant. So instead of few asking many, let's have many asking few questions. If Karthik probably buys this logic, so that, at least a few questions can be addressed from many people. If
sure,
you're
sure. I'm absolutely fine with that.
Sure.
So we'll take a couple of more questions, and each person can ask one question each.
Sure.
All right, and that'll be a wrap. So Karthik, would you like to go next?
Yeah.
Hello, Karthik.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you watched Chidambara Ragasyam or like those old K Balachandar serials, like
Oh
with
yes, absolutely.
intense,
Yeah.
like Vidada Karupu and all. So so do you think like that kind of like a series with that kind of a storytelling can be a hit in podcast format?
Well, for the benefit of others who don't speak this language, I think those are shows which are thrillers, actually written and narrated by a guy called Naga. Um, See, I would answer it this way, right? Rather than talk about those shows which are very visual in nature, I think thrillers as a space is huge, especially crime thrillers is very, very huge in the podcasting world, right? Um, there is definitely a space for it. I would love to listen to a show like the one you mentioned, Karthik, if someone can create it. Right? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of shows like that as we speak.
Yes, sir, makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Karthik. Janam can voice out your question now.
Hello. Can you hear me?
It's a little feeble, but I can hear you. Yes.
Sir, to add to Karthik's question, I actually wanted to understand, is there any future for interactive podcasting like the movie Bandersnatch? Like you can have multiple endings and the listener can choose it.
Right. Ideally, you could, but the thing with Bandersnatch is, or for that matter, any interactive thing is, you need a lot of platform customization, right? So today on a Spotify or on any of those big platforms, to say that, hey, listen, if I click here, you need to capture this and give me a different action. Those are, from a product perspective, fairly difficult. But if you're, for example, creating a show on your own platform, right, or on a customized platform, it should be very, very easy for you to sort of do that, right? So theoretically, yes. Practically, but then if you're doing it in your own platform, then you're affecting the distribution of that as well, right? So that is the interesting challenge for you to solve. But I would love to hear one.
Oh, thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Janam. Now we are moving on to the last question for the day. Shaktik, are you here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
please.
Hi, sir. Thank you for your speech, your presentation. I'll ask the question I wanted to ask. It's like, what is the future trend of podcasts in the Indian market? And are there any specific themes that are more popular than others?
Right.
Indian.
I think most definitely we're going to see a lot of Indic languages happening in podcasting, right? I gave you a couple of examples already. But there are some fantastic shows in many different Indian languages. I think that is one thing that is going to happen. The other thing that will most definitely happen is shows on very, like I said, the journalistic part of this in India is fairly empty right now, right? Someone like a Faye D'Souza, for example, let's just quit Mirror now, and then she's doing her own thing on Instagram and YouTube. I would pay to listen to her podcast if she did a news show, right? I've told her this many times myself. So things like this, I feel, are big spaces. And also, we're such a vibrant culture, right? We can eat Europe and America for breakfast when it comes to our cultural history. So to sort of go back, tap into that, and sort of create shows around mythology, shows around our own food, etc. It's a treasure trove, right? So I feel our culture, journalism, and Indic languages, these are three big trends, I feel. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all these questions. And to everybody who couldn't get your question answers, if Karthik doesn't mind, we can reach out with unanswered questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, my social handles, I will leave my email ID as well with you. So more than happy to keep this conversation going.
Yes, so please reach out to us with your questions, and we certainly reach out to Karthik with them. And with that, we come to the end of our workshop on podcasting. Thank you so much, Karthik, for being with us and providing us with such amazing insights and inspiration about the world of podcasting. It was an honor having you with us today. We would also like to thank our IT department for making virtual Comvisage 2020 a reality and for ensuring that we could host this podcast workshop as smoothly as possible. I now request everyone to please switch on their videos so we can take a group picture.
It's done.
Are we good? Yeah, it's done. Okay, okay. Thank you everyone for staying with us for the picture and for being here with us today. With this, we have come to the end of day one of Comvisage 2020. We hope to see you for our next session tomorrow morning, a corporate talk on analyzing culture insights by Mr. Masar Hashmi. Until then, please take care, stay safe, and have a great evening ahead.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.